You know, guys, I just realized something. After this interview with Benedict, we've been guilty of violating the national security law. We've been talking about targeted sanctions on China and Hong Kong.
We haven't just been talking about targeted sanctions. We've been encouraging countries.
Actively recommending.
Yes, to sanction Hong Kong and China. So that definitely does seem to put us in violation of the NSL.
Do you think we shouldn't go back to Hong Kong right now?
I think that if they applied the law retroactively on Apple Daily already, we've been in trouble since,
2014 when we first covered the umbrella movement in Hong Kong?
Exactly.
Probably
before that. If we
spent a night in the tents. Remember that?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's kind of crazy to think about right now. Just how hopeful people were.
Oh, yeah.
At the time. I remember... walking around, and then we met Zhou Fengsuo there for the first time, right? And
Tiananmen survivor.
Yeah, and he talked about how much it reminded him of the kind of the spirit of Tiananmen Square protesters, and
It really kind of followed through with the spirit of Tiananmen, too.
Well, just like a very slow motion one.
Tank wreck?
Yeah, it's just like instead of just wrecking it directly with a tank, it just took... Oh gosh, what was it? Only 7 years, 6 years for them to essentially crush everything.
2019, yeah.
So who was the in Hong Kong situation? Who was the Hong Kong tank man who stood in front of this long line of tanks with his shopping bags, resisting?
Well, it was 2 million people in that one march.
That's true.
I'll never forget that either. That was insane to see that many people on one street.
Yeah. But I think you're making a good point. Like, the Communist Party has wised up about how to do things like this. There was a lot of fear in Hong Kong, especially in 2019 when we were there, that, they're going to send in the tanks. They're going to send in the tanks. The Communist Party is smarter than that now. They're not going to do that. They're going to create some stupid legal system that they can achieve exactly what they want. And then what are people going to do? It's
interesting because I think... I remember we were all, because we had that hotel room that looked over one of the main roads in Central.
Pretty close to Ledgeco.
Yeah, and we were just like, well, if the tanks come, we can see them coming. But yeah, I mean, they have riot police, so they were never going to send in the military anymore. Mm-hmm. That's one thing they did. But like you said, yes, the other thing is lawfare.
Yeah. So. If it had been like a massacre, Tesla would not be going into China and licking boot. I think if it were like bloody bodies on the streets of Hong Kong.
Yeah,
students.
Tesla would have had to wait several years.
Yeah, at least 10 years or so.
No, I mean
3 years, but yeah.
3 years. Like, yeah, well, think about the whole, George Bush doing is secretly sending someone
that month.
Yeah, to be like, no, don't worry, it's going to be okay.
George Bush Sr., Tiananmen Square Massacre.
Yeah, it's just, maybe I'm too cynical about the fact that I think that they would have bounced back with the Olympics in 2022, no problem, even if they had sent in tanks in 2019.
If the world fails to boycott the 2022 Olympics, we have failed.
Right. But also, think about how much of the world the Chinese Communist Party has co-opted, right? So,
the entirety?
Yeah, but in different ways, right? So there's, 100-something countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I would say all of those countries are, to some degree, co-opted. Many of them are in debt, actual financial debt to China. So they have that leverage being held over them. And then you have, the Western countries are co-opted in different ways, but it's all this subtle infiltration, right? Like you've got the Chinese communist money investing in American tech companies. You've got American investment companies like BlackRock that are invested in the China market and want to be able to get the money out of China eventually that they've invested. So they're going to fight tooth and nail for the Communist Party. Right?
Or just how we are dependent on medical supplies from China now.
Medical supplies, vitamins, steel, a lot of manufacturing, our iPhones, all these things. It's going to take a lot of time to move the production out of China, and American companies want to resist that. So essentially, you've got American and other, whether it's German companies or British companies, they're essentially, the companies are co-opted. And because we know that large companies have a disproportionate impact on policy, in America and wherever, then like that's essentially how the Western countries are co-opted. So despite, whatever morally, people like Antony Blinken want to do, right? He's going to be limited. Biden is limited. Nancy Pelosi is limited because there's so much corporate interest trying to push against any type of anti-Chinese Communist Party legislation.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing, though, the flip side of that is in 1989, China didn't have that much of an impact on the rest of the world. So it was easier for the rest of the world to kind of ignore the Tiananmen Square massacre in a certain way because it didn't directly affect them. Now you can't really pretend that China doesn't affect the rest of the world. And that's one of the arguments that people have been making to engage with China or something like, it's going to bring more freedom, that kind of stuff. It's obviously not true anymore.
It's American tech that has built the surveillance system in Xinjiang.
Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible that, we can still kind of have companies being like, well, if we go in and we work with them, that's not a problem. But it was interesting. I saw an article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal the other day, about how we're vulnerable because the largest chip maker in the world, microchip maker, semiconductor, is TSMC in Taiwan. And it was this article about how it's, the world is vulnerable because we depend on this one company in Taiwan so much for our microchips. And who's writing the article about how vulnerable we are because we depend on China for, all this other stuff? Like, nobody's writing that article.
Oh, wait. So the point wasn't that that chip maker does have business relations with the Chinese Communist Party, which is stupid that a Taiwanese company would be doing.
Yeah, it was that the rest of the world could be at risk if China takes over Taiwan, or if the coronavirus, something takes out this chip maker in Taiwan, then the rest of the world is vulnerable.
Oh, okay.
Right, but we're already like way more vulnerable for so many other things than just that.
Right. On our vulnerability to China, like to the Chinese Communist Party, is huge. But people don't really want to talk about it. And I don't know if it's because it's not evident or if it's because, it's nobody wants to touch that.
Well, hey, how about we write an opinion piece for the Wall Street Journal that says that? Do you think they'll accept it?
Or we could at least write a BuzzFeed listicle top 10 ways the U.S. is vulnerable to China, right? And you can list things like, solar panels being made in China, car batteries being made in China.
If it's going to be a list of everything that's made in China, we're going to need more than 10.
Yeah. Oh, okay, sure.
But top 10 things.
Top 10.
Yeah.
This isn't a list of 10,000 things that we're vulnerable for.
Maybe it should be a list of 10,000 things, because then people would kind of realize how vulnerable we are. Yeah. I mean, I think that this is part of the tragedy of Hong Kong, too, is that, people in Hong Kong, when we were there, some of the protesters told us things like, we know this is probably not going to end well for us, but they felt that it was worth something, at least, if they could kind of be the thing that wakes the rest of the world up to the dangers of the Chinese Communist Party. Like, if you want to talk about who was Tank Man, it was kind of like Hong Kong was Tank Man for the rest of the world.
Point.
That they knew that they were putting themselves in the line of fire, and that it was, possibly hopeless because Hong Kong wasn't like Taiwan. It's already controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So they knew what they were doing, but they also thought, if we can at least be a warning to the rest of the world, we can stop the Chinese regime from, taking over the entire world, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was helpful, but I feel like even the coronavirus, a global pandemic that killed millions, hasn't fully woken up the world.
Well, I think this is why one reason that the Chinese Communist Party is also very afraid of this investigation into the possibility of the lab leak thing, because essentially they kind of got away with their cover-up, where people weren't really blaming them for that initial month-long cover-up that led to the pandemic.
Yes, thanks to Western media and Western medical journals that were being funded by the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, they have some things that they're complicit about regarding the lab leak thing, too. But, it's just the idea that, okay, they kind of got away with it. So now if we're going to reopen this can of worms and look at just how culpable they might have been, they're scared of that the way that they're scared of sanctions.
Right. But, in terms of the lab leak hypothesis, like this interestingly exposes the type of vulnerability that we have, which is that regardless of whether ultimately it is objectively true or not that the COVID-19 leaked from a Chinese lab, like the idea of investigating it shows how vulnerable we are because it shows the infiltration of the Chinese Communist Party into so many aspects of economics and politics, right? So like you've got the obvious ones like China, controlling PPE and medical stuff that they can hold over our heads, but also their control over scientific journals because, as you mentioned on China Uncensored, the Chinese Communist Party is paying Western scientific publishing companies to publish Chinese journals. And so these Western companies that control, Nature Medicine journal and The Lancet are both the publishing companies that own those also are getting money from
they're dependent.
Chinese companies. So there's that dependency, right? That creates a type of vulnerability and an incentive to self-censor. And then on top of that, you've got, like the NIH, the U.S. National Institutes of Health, that were funding EcoHealth Alliance that then were involved in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And that, like everyone now at the National Institutes of Health and people like Dr. Anthony Fauci with the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, signed off on this. And like, so you've got all this complicity and years of working with China. So like everyone's got these ties where they're either like financially dependent or they're, embarrassed by the ties that they had, at so many different levels. It prevents any type of honesty about what really happened, any type of real honest investigation into what happened.